We have spent much of the semester talking about how learning occurs and how behavior changes through our experiences with the environment. This last lecture for the semester is going to focus on what the limits of those processes are. More specifically, we're going to look over some physical and genetic characteristics that contribute to what we are actually capable of learning, as well as some environmental aspects, such as neurological damage, critical periods, and then we'll end by looking at the concept of preparedness. To start, physical characteristics of a learner do play a role in what we are physically capable of learning from our environment. By that, I mean that our bodies are designed in such a way that some things are not possible to learn. For example, chimpanzees cannot learn to talk. They don't have the vocal cords, the physical structure that humans do to allow them to produce the speech sounds that people produce. Similarly, humans actually have limits to their own learning. For example, we can't learn to fly like certain birds can. That being said, many species have the capability to overcome these limits in certain ways. For example, you might be familiar with chimpanzees learning sign language. And although they can never actually learn to talk, they can learn to use human communication in a similar way. There's one documented case where a chimpanzee was taught over 200 words in a 2-year period of time, which is pretty rapid acquisition of language skills. Many of you have probably seen videos of this happening. They can learn to use signs that describe emotions, to communicate needs, and so on and so forth. And an interesting question that this brings up, however, is whether or not being able to use sign language means that chimps can actually use human language. I want you to think for a second about what we've learned so far. Are chimps learning human language, or are there other explanations for what's happening during this process? Hopefully what you're able to arrive at when you think about that is classical and operant conditioning. Chimps learn that making a certain sign will result in a certain reinforcement, or to associate a certain sign with a certain emotion, need, or something along those lines. And although this is very similar to how humans learn to speak, it is a much more simplistic use of human language. In addition to our body's physical limitations, we know that there are certain limitations to the extent to which learned behaviors can benefit a species. So think back to Unit 1 when we learned about reflexes and fixed action patterns. Heads up, if you don't remember what those are, you do need to know that for the final. Reflexes are uncontrolled, automatic things that our body does to respond to the environment on a very specific basis, things like blinking, while fixed action patterns are larger, more holistic patterns of behaviors that we're born with. So I want you to think about for a second some behaviors that are heritable. Again, think along the lines of reflexes and fixed action patterns. We do have behaviors that we pass on to other generations, to offspring. Things like migrating south for the summer, things like blinking and sneezing. Now I want you to think about some behaviors that are not heritable. Interestingly enough, we know talking, knowing words isn't heritable. A dog sitting on command isn't heritable. Learning how to use tools in a complex way. These are all things that we have to relearn. So although the learning process, learning behaviors benefits an individual, we know that much of learning is not, or learned behaviors are not heritable, meaning that each individual in a species has to relearn those behaviors. That being said, oftentimes we can learn these behaviors by more mature, more senior members of our species, our community. So in that sense, we can pass those behaviors along. But much of what we learn from our environment is not heritable. An interesting study looking at heritability and learned abilities compared dogs to wolves. You're likely familiar with the fact that dogs and wolves are closely related. You can think of them as cousins, but they do have some distinct differences. This one study looked at intelligence between dogs and wolves. And what they found was that wolf puppies actually performed better on a variety of tasks that were used to assess their intelligence. Take a second and think about why you think that is. That might be kind of contrary to what you would have guessed. We think that dogs, man's best friend, are very intelligent, they're very smart creatures, and they are. But studies have actually shown us that wolves are more intelligent. One thing that we know is that the modern day dog is the product of decades of breeding, centuries of breeding. And we breed dogs for many traits, such as loyalty, such as speed in some cases, such as friendliness, cuteness, having certain physical characteristics. But we actually don't tend to breed dogs for their intelligence. On the other hand, wolves are reared in the wild, meaning that they're subject to their environment, and as such, being intelligent is going to be a trait to allow for survival. Because of that, only the more intelligent wolves have lived on to pass their traits to offspring. And because of this, wolves are more intelligent than dogs. Another interesting note about intelligence is that it dictates the potential that we have to learn a behavior. So not only is intelligence heritable, an ability we pass on to future generations, but it also determines what we're then capable of learning from our own environment. Interestingly enough, we know that variation within species means that even within very intelligent wolf breeds, intelligence is going to vary between individuals, meaning that we may all be born with the same abilities, intelligence, type behaviors, but each of us is going to vary to some extent, and that variation will determine how much learning occurs. The next thing I want to look at that enforces a limit on our ability to learn is actually neurological damage. We know that the brain is vital to the learning process. Without a healthy functioning brain, learning is not going to occur the way that it should. Because of that, I want to go over some of the more common neurological limits placed on learning that we often experience. We know that heritability, our genes, limits learning, but the environment can limit learning as well. By this, I mean that we're all born with certain neurological capabilities, getting back to intelligence, that's nature, that's heritability, but we're also born into or conceived in an environment, a nurturing environment that will determine how we develop in terms of learned behaviors. One interesting thing that limits learning is exposure to neurotoxins. These are going to be things like nicotine, alcohol, radiation, prescription drugs, certain viruses, stress. Anything in the environment that harms neurological functioning will in fact limit our ability to learn behaviors. A neurotoxin, again, is any substance that damages nerve tissue. Damaging nerve tissues limits our capacity to learn behaviors. A few examples of these: prenatal teratogens are actually very important. Prenatal teratogens are any environmental variable that can harm a developing fetus in utero. So think about fetal alcohol syndrome and other disorders, diseases, conditions along those lines. Exposure to these types of chemicals, variables in our environment can impact how our brain develops in utero even before we're born, and can subsequently limit our ability to learn later on in life. Drug consumption at any point in life can also limit our learning ability, as can things like lead paint, certain environmental toxins that we might not necessarily think of. Another aspect of our neurological functioning that can impact learning is actually head injuries, which are more common than you might think. Suffering from a severe head injury, this can be from a car accident, this can be from an athletic activity, can drastically and very quickly limit our learning potential. And this goes for non-humans also. Some common sources of head injuries: child abuse. Children who are severely abused, unfortunately, might have a limited capacity to learn later in life because of that event or events. Again, certain sports, things like wrestling, soccer, football, we all know those are associated with head injuries. Malnutrition is another environmental factor that can limit our learning capacity. This is true specifically or particularly during neural development earlier on in life, starting in utero, starting at conception, throughout early childhood. Good nutrition is very important then, but it's also important throughout the lifespan, even into late adulthood, into our 80s and 90s. We know that proper nutrition is vital to maintain good cognitive functioning and memory. Many people think that suffering memory problems, cognitive problems later in life is inevitable. And while everyone does experience some degree of memory issues, cognitive functioning issues, we know that lifestyle choices, eating right, working out, not becoming overstressed, things like that can actually really help out and allow us to continue with good functioning throughout our entire lifespan. Again, malnutrition can be problematic in utero, during prenatal development, during childhood, and throughout the entire lifespan up until we're in our elderly, late adulthood years. An interesting aspect of that is something we call critical periods. Critical periods are specific stages in life where we're predisposed or more likely or undergoing a greater extent of learning for a specific behavior. You can think of a critical period as the optimum or the best time to learn a specific behavior. Some examples. We know that childhood is actually the critical period for language development, meaning that childhood is when we undergo most of that development. And if we miss it, if we skip that critical period, we might never be able to learn language abilities at an adult functioning level. Infancy is the critical period for attachment development. Attachment is one of the bases of our social relationships. Attachment is how we approach, how we think about what our working model for relationships are. And a lot of how we conceptualize relationships is based off our earliest ones, the relationships we have with our parents. So infancy, those first few years of life, are actually vital to developing healthy attachment. Another interesting example, domesticating dogs is actually easiest when they're puppies. If you have a dog that was not raised around people, you're going to have a lot harder time domesticating it when it's farther along in its life. We know that critical periods play a big role or are vital in the development of some learned behaviors. And in fact, they can be so important that if we miss that period, we will be completely unable or almost completely unable to learn a behavior. Language is a great example of that. Children have to be exposed to language from the get-go, from the beginning. If that doesn't happen, it is almost impossible, or in fact, some studies suggest that it is impossible to learn language, to learn human communication. If you think about feral children, children that somehow survived on their own in the wild or were severely neglected, never exposed to spoken language in their household, you might be familiar with some cases where the child who maybe was taken out of that environment at 9 or 11 was almost completely unable to learn how to talk. That demonstrates the power of the critical period in terms of our ability to learn certain behaviors. So, we've gone over a few environmental aspects that impact how well or how capable we are of learning certain behaviors. But there are other variables. We've talked about heredity, we've talked about physical ability and critical periods. Another variable we want to look at is this idea of predisposition, or being predisposed, being prone to learning certain behaviors, almost having a natural inclination to either learn or not learn something. We know that people have are capable of experiencing something we call instinctive drift when it comes to learning. This is what happens when An animal or a human during the learning process reverts back to using a fixed action pattern. So basically the way this happens is the animal is stressed out, they don't know what to do, there's a problem, and in order to solve that problem, they revert back to one of those innate fixed action patterns. Instinctive drift. We're stressed, there's an issue we need to fix, we revert back and use something that we were born with. A great example of this, if you teach a raccoon how to solve a certain task, they're actually, if that task involves a movement that they use to eat or prepare food, which is a fixed action pattern of a raccoon, they're actually better able to learn it. Raccoons, when they prepare food, kind of rub like a nut or something between their hands to get it ready. So if you want to teach them how to perform a certain behavior that can benefit from this instinctive drift and use that same fixed action pattern behavior, they're more likely to learn it. Another interesting phenomenon where we are predisposed to engage in a certain behavior is something called auto-shaping. And this is when a behavior involves instinctive drift that's not reinforced. So, instinctive drift, those behaviors, those fixed action patterns are reinforced because you are rewarded by, the food, whatever the object is you're working with. But sometimes we revert back to these behaviors in the absence of reinforcement. For example, research has shown that pigeons can be trained to peck a disc to get food. They peck the disc and the food is dispensed, even if the food was never contingent on the behavior of pecking. So pigeons will basically randomly or seemingly randomly start pecking in order to get food, a disc, in the absence of having shaped that behavior, because pecking is a predisposed natural behavior for them. Another interesting aspect of preparedness is this concept that we call the continuum of preparedness. This theory basically states that all animals, human, dogs, pigeons, anything we've talked about, come into a learning situation or are born, arrive at a problem, genetically, naturally predisposed to either learn, naturally unprepared to learn, or naturally counter-prepared. So basically what this means is everyone has a set of predispositions that in any given situation will either make it easier for them to learn, make it harder for them to learn, or make it kind of a neutral situation. A great example of this looks at our predisposition to fear snakes. We've talked briefly in the past about how all humans are predisposed to be afraid of snakes. Well, if a girl slams her hand in a door after seeing a snake, she's very quickly going to develop that fear because she's predisposed to learn. Okay? It would be a lot harder for her to have slammed her hand in a door and happen to look down and see a puppy at the same time. She probably wouldn't develop a fear of that puppy. But because we are predisposed to fear snakes, this very simple experience might prompt a phobia in the girl. This is why, or one potential reason, why fear of snakes or phobias associated with snakes are so common. The opposite of that is being counter-prepared. And this is when certain behaviors or predispositions are going to make it harder to learn. So we have behaviors that will be harder to learn if they involve the opposite of a behavior we're genetically predisposed to doing, meaning that it's very, very difficult for us to learn any behavior that's the opposite of our predispositions. A very silly example here, it would be extremely hard for a person to learn not to blink. So when we're going into an environment, into a situation where learning a behavior is important, it's also equally important to remember that an individual comes into that environment with certain predispositions, certain things that are going to make it harder or easier, or may make it harder or easier for them to learn. Having a good understanding of that is vital to understanding when and how certain behaviors can be learned.